Dakota Territory, 1878. While every settler raced to build steep-pitched roofs to shed snow quickly, German immigrant Wilhelm Brandt was still working on his cabin in late September. His neighbors called his roof lazy. They called him a fool. He built a shallow 30-degree slope facing south, not the steep pitch everyone knew was necessary for Dakota winters. He lined his interior walls with stone, while others used simple wood. He spent 2 months on details others finished in 3 weeks, creating a 3-foot overhang that blocked summer sun, but welcomed winter rays. Then February 1879 arrived. The blizzard hit without warning. Temperatures plummeted to 40 below zero. Winds reached 60 miles per hour. 6 feet of snow in 3 days. Steep roofs collapsed under the weight. Settlers burned through 8 to 10 cords of firewood and still froze. But Wilhelm's lazy cabin? It stayed 20 degrees warmer than his neighbors' homes. He used half their firewood. Families who had mocked him came seeking shelter, finding warmth they couldn't achieve in their own homes. What did this German carpenter understand about capturing winter sun and storing heat that seasoned frontiersmen completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The wind cut across the Dakota prairie with a bite that promised winter would arrive early and stay late. Wilhelm Brandt stood beside his half-completed cabin frame, measuring the angle of his roof boards one more time with the careful precision that had marked every decision he'd made since breaking ground in late July. The other settlers had finished their cabins weeks ago, but Wilhelm continued working, adjusting the pitch to exactly 30 degrees, a slope so shallow it looked almost flat compared to the steep-angled roofs dotting the landscape around him. "You building a shed or a house, Wilhelm?" John McAllister called out from his wagon, reining in his horses to get a better look at the peculiar construction. McAllister had been in Dakota Territory for over 2 decades, long enough to know what worked and what didn't in these brutal winters. His own cabin sported a traditional steep pitch of 55 degrees, designed to shed snow the moment it hit the shingles. "That roof's going to cave in come first blizzard. Snow will pile up 3 feet thick with nothing to push it off." Wilhelm looked up from his work, wiping sawdust from his hands on his leather apron. The German immigrant had learned English well enough during his 3 years in America, but he still spoke with the careful deliberation of a man translating thoughts. "In my homeland, we build different. The sun, it comes low in winter. This roof, it catches the warmth." McAllister laughed, the sound carrying across the opens prairie to where other neighbors had begun gathering to witness this daily spectacle of what they considered German stubbornness. "Sun don't mean nothing when you got 6 feet of snow crushing your rafters. You need steep pitch to shed that load, or you'll be digging yourself out of the rubble come spring." Harriet Miller approached from her own homestead, carrying a basket of late-season vegetables from her garden. She'd grown fond of Wilhelm during the summer months. He was always willing to help with heavy work and never expected anything in return, but even she questioned his building methods. "Wilhelm, I know you mean well, but John's right about the snow load. My husband built our roof at 60 degrees on the advice of the territorial surveyor. Said anything less than 50 degrees was asking for trouble." Wilhelm climbed down from his ladder and walked to the south-facing wall, where he'd been installing something the others had never seen before. Stones. Not a stone foundation, which every cabin had, but carefully selected flat stones mortared directly into the interior wall structure. Each stone measured roughly 12 inches square and 4 inches thick, positioned to catch direct sunlight through the cabin's southern windows. These stones, they hold the heat from sun. During day, they become warm. At night, they give warmth back to cabin. Stone walls? David Foster, the carpenter from New England, scratched his beard thoughtfully. Unlike the others, he'd heard whispers of European building techniques that used thermal mass, though he'd never seen them implemented. "That's going to take forever to heat up, Wilhelm. You'll burn twice as much firewood just warming those stones." "No," Wilhelm replied, pointing to his roof's carefully calculated overhang. "In summer, sun is high. This roof, it blocks sun from stones, keeps cabin cool. In winter, sun is low. It shines deep into cabin, warms stones all day. Then stones, they warm cabin all night. He gestured to his neighbors' cabins. Your cabins, they lose heat fast when fire dies down. My cabin, it keeps heat till morning. The gathered settlers exchanged glances. What Wilhelm described sounded logical in theory, but it flew in the face of everything they'd learned about frontier construction. Speed was essential. Get a roof overhead before winter arrived. Worry about comfort later. Wilhelm's approach required time they didn't feel they had, and materials that seemed wasteful. McAllister shook his head firmly. Wilhelm, I've lived through 20 Dakota winters. Trust me when I tell you that roof won't hold. First good snowfall, you'll have 3 feet of snow sitting right there on those shallow rafters. Weight'll be enormous. And all those stones? They'll just make your cabin colder, pulling heat right out of the air. Lazy roof, someone called from the back of the group, and the phrase stuck immediately. Within days, everyone in the settlement was referring to Wilhelm's construction as the lazy roof, too flat to do the work of shedding snow, built by a man too stubborn to listen to practical frontier wisdom. Wilhelm continued his work undeterred, installing each stone with meticulous care and ensuring his roof overhang extended exactly 3 feet from the south wall. He'd calculated this measurement based on the sun's winter angle at 45 degrees north latitude, though he didn't bother explaining the mathematics to neighbors who already considered his methods foolish. The overhang would block the high summer sun completely, while allowing low winter rays to penetrate deep into the cabin's interior. As September turned to October and the first frost painted the prairie grass silver, Wilhelm was still working. He installed double-thick log walls with sawdust insulation between them, another wasteful practice that drew criticism from neighbors who'd built single-wall cabins in half the time. His windows faced south exclusively, sized and positioned to maximize winter sun exposure, while his stone thermal mass absorbed and stored the solar energy. "Man's going to freeze to death in that contraption," McAllister told his wife one evening as they watched smoke rise from Wilhelm's cabin. "All that stone and those big south-facing windows, place'll be cold as a cave come January. Mark my words, he'll be begging for shelter in a proper cabin before winter's half done." By late October, when the first snow dusted the prairie, Wilhelm finally declared his cabin complete. It looked nothing like the other structures in the settlement, where their roofs peaked sharply toward the sky, his sloped gently southward, where their cabins presented uniform log walls on all sides. His featured large windows facing the winter sun and stone-lined interior walls that seemed to glow golden in the afternoon light. The other settlers had spent 3 weeks building their homes. Wilhelm had spent nearly 3 months perfecting his. The first test would come soon enough. Winter in Dakota Territory showed no mercy to those who guessed wrong about survival, and every neighbor who'd watched Wilhelm's strange construction wondered if they'd be digging his frozen body out from under a collapsed roof come spring. The thermometer outside John McAllister's cabin read 28 degrees below zero on the morning of January 15th, 1879, and the mercury had been dropping steadily for 3 days. What had started as a typical Dakota winter had transformed into something far more brutal than even the old-timers could remember. The wind howled across the prairie with a ferocity that made stepping outside feel like walking into a wall of knives, and the snow that had fallen steadily since Christmas now stood 4 feet deep across the settlement. McAllister climbed onto his roof for the 3rd time that week, his boots crunching through the crystalline layer that formed whenever snow met the steep pitch of his cabin. The accumulated weight pressed down on his rafters with an ominous creaking that kept him awake at night. Each shovelful he threw to the ground landed with a thud that echoed across the frozen landscape, but within hours, more snow would take its place. His neighbors faced the same exhausting routine. David Foster had already cleared his roof 6 times since New Year's Day, and Harriet Miller's husband had recruited their oldest son to help with the increasingly dangerous task of snow removal. Inside McAllister's cabin, the temperature hovered at 34 degrees despite a fire that consumed nearly half a cord of wood each week. Ice formed on the interior walls. Wherever his breath met the cold logs, creating patterns that reminded him unpleasantly of the frost on his bedroom windows back in Ohio. His wife wrapped herself in 3 wool blankets during the day and still shivered uncontrollably. They'd already burned through 6 cords of their winter wood supply, leaving only 2 cords remaining for what promised to be at least 2 more months of brutal cold. Across the settlement, similar scenes played out in every cabin. Foster's family huddled around their stone fireplace, burning split oak at a rate that made him calculate and recalculate their remaining fuel supply. The interior temperature in his cabin had dropped to 30 degrees the previous night, forcing his family to sleep fully clothed under every blanket they owned. Harriet Miller's cabin fared no better. Despite burning green wood that filled their home with acrid smoke, the temperature inside rarely climbed above freezing, and her youngest child had developed a persistent cough that worried her through the long, dark nights. The steep roofs that had seemed so practical during construction now revealed their fatal flaw. Snow accumulated faster than it could be removed, creating dangerous loads that stressed every joint and beam. Foster's roof sagged visibly in the center, requiring him to install temporary support posts in his main room. The constant cycle of melting and refreezing created ice dams that forced water back under the shingles, dripping steadily into living spaces and forming treacherous puddles that froze solid each night. Wilhelm Brandt's cabin presented a stark contrast to the struggle consuming his neighbors. The shallow 30-degree pitch of his roof shed snow naturally, preventing the dangerous accumulations that plagued every other structure in the settlement. When snow did collect on his roof, the southern exposure and dark shingles absorbed enough solar energy even on cloudy days to create a gentle melting action that kept the load manageable. No ice dams formed along his carefully calculated 3-foot overhang, and no emergency roof clearing interrupted his daily routine. Inside Wilhelm's cabin, the thermal mass system he'd installed performed exactly as he'd predicted. The large south-facing windows captured every available ray of winter sunlight, directing the solar energy onto the stone-lined interior wall. Even on the coldest days when the sun appeared for only brief periods through the gray clouds, the stones absorbed and stored enough heat to maintain an interior temperature of 54 degrees. At night, as temperatures outside plummeted to 30 below zero, the heated stones released their stored energy gradually, keeping the cabin warm enough that Wilhelm could work at his table in shirt sleeves while his neighbors shivered in multiple layers. His firewood consumption told the most dramatic story. While McAllister burned through half a cord weekly and Foster struggled to stretch his diminishing supply, Wilhelm used only 1/4 cord per week. The combination of solar gain and thermal mass storage reduced his heating needs by more than 60% compared to his neighbor's consumption. His 4-cord winter supply, which his neighbors had predicted would prove insufficient, now seemed likely to last through March with wood to spare. The physical evidence of Wilhelm's success became impossible to ignore as January dragged toward February. Smoke rose constantly from every chimney in the settlement except Wilhelm's, which produced only occasional wisps during the coldest nights. Visitors to his cabin, and there were increasingly many as word spread of his comfortable interior temperature, found themselves removing coats and gloves within minutes of entering, a luxury unavailable in any other home in the territory. McAllister's wife developed chilblains on her hands and feet from constant exposure to near-freezing temperatures inside their cabin. Foster's family took to sleeping together in one bed to share body heat, and Harriet Miller's youngest child spent most days wrapped in blankets near their fireplace, too cold to play or move around normally. The contrast with Wilhelm's cabin, where normal indoor activities continued throughout the winter, became a source of growing frustration and grudging curiosity among the settlers who had mocked his construction methods just months earlier. By early February, the settlement's wood supplies had dwindled to critical levels. Several families faced the prospect of burning furniture or fence posts to maintain minimal heat in their drafty cabins. The steep roofs continued to accumulate dangerous snow loads, and the constant battle against ice dams created pools of standing water that froze into treacherous sheets. Meanwhile, Wilhelm's lazy roof continued to shed snow naturally, his stone walls continued to store solar energy, and his wood supply remained adequate for the remainder of the winter season that showed no signs of relenting. The barometric pressure began dropping on February 6, 1879, creating an ominous stillness that experienced frontiersmen recognized as the precursor to something catastrophic. By evening, the western horizon had darkened to an unnatural shade of green-black, and the temperature plummeted 15 degrees in 2 hours. John McAllister stepped outside his cabin to check his animals and felt the air itself seemed to thicken with approaching violence. Within 6 hours, what meteorologists would later classify as one of the most severe blizzards in Dakota Territory history slammed into the settlement with winds that reached 67 miles per hour and temperatures that dropped to 43 degrees below zero. The storm struck with such sudden ferocity that McAllister barely made it back to his cabin before visibility dropped to zero. Snow fell not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets driven by winds that howled like freight trains across the prairie. Within the first hour, drifts began forming against every vertical surface, and by midnight, snow had accumulated to depths that made movement between buildings impossible. The blizzard would continue unabated for 4 days and 3 nights, depositing over 6 feet of snow across the territory and creating drifts that towered 12 feet high against cabin walls. McAllister's steep-pitched roof, already stressed by weeks of accumulated snow, began groaning ominously under the additional load. The 55-degree angle that was supposed to shed snow efficiently became a trap for the wind-driven precipitation, which packed into dense layers that weighed nearly twice as much as normal snowfall. By the second day of the storm, he could hear his roof timbers creaking with each gust of wind, and a visible sag had developed along the ridgeline. The constant sound of settling wood and straining joints filled his cabin, punctuated by the terrifying crack of lumber approaching its breaking point. Inside his cabin, the temperature dropped to 18 degrees despite burning his remaining cord of seasoned oak at a rate that would exhaust his supply within days. Ice formed on the interior walls, in sheets thick enough to scrape with a knife, and his family's breath created clouds of vapor that froze into crystals before dissipating. His wife and children huddled together under every blanket they owned, but hypothermia symptoms began appearing by the third day: confusion, lethargy, and uncontrollable shivering that indicated their core body temperature was dropping to dangerous levels. David Foster's cabin faced similar catastrophic stress. The accumulated snow load on his 60-degree pitched roof exceeded the structural capacity of his hastily constructed rafters, and a loud crack during the storm's second night announced the failure of his central roof beam. Snow began filtering through gaps in the damaged structure, creating wet, freezing conditions inside the cabin that made maintaining body heat nearly impossible. His family took refuge in the root cellar, where the Earth's thermal mass provided marginally better protection than their collapsing home above ground. Harriet Miller's situation became desperate when her husband collapsed from exhaustion after attempting to clear snow from their roof during a brief lull in the storm. The physical demands of moving hundreds of pounds of packed snow in sub-zero temperatures proved too much for his cold, weakened body, and he developed symptoms of severe hypothermia that left him barely conscious. With her youngest child already weakened by weeks of cold exposure and her husband unable to maintain their fire, Harriet faced the terrifying prospect of losing her entire family to the storm. On the morning of February 10th, as the blizzard finally began to abate, the sound of splintering wood echoed across the settlement. McAllister's roof had partially collapsed, allowing snow and frigid air to pour directly into his living space. The 40-foot ridge beam, constructed from local pine that had dried inadequately during the rushed building season, had snapped cleanly in two under the accumulated weight. Half his cabin lay open to the elements, and his family faced immediate exposure to conditions that would prove fatal within hours. Foster's family emerged from their root cellar to find their cabin uninhabitable. The roof damage had allowed snow to accumulate throughout the interior, creating icy conditions that made heating impossible even if fuel had been available. With their wood supply completely exhausted and temperatures still hovering near 30 below zero, they faced the stark reality that shelter in their damaged cabin meant certain death. Through the settling snow and dying wind, smoke rose steadily from only one chimney in the entire settlement. Wilhelm Brandt's cabin had weathered the storm without structural damage, its shallow-pitched roof continuing to shed snow efficiently even under blizzard conditions. The 30-degree angle that had drawn such ridicule proved perfectly engineered for the wind patterns created by the storm, allowing the horizontal snow to blow across the surface rather than accumulating in dangerous loads. Inside Wilhelm's cabin, the thermal mass system had performed beyond even his expectations. The stone-lined walls had absorbed solar energy during the brief clear periods between storm fronts, and the stored heat had maintained an interior temperature of 47 degrees throughout the worst of the blizzard. His family remained comfortable in normal indoor clothing while their neighbors fought hypothermia, and his wood consumption had actually decreased during the storm as the cabin's thermal efficiency reached its optimal performance level. As word of the structural failures spread through the settlement, desperate families began making their way through the deep snow toward the one cabin that had proven equal to the storm's fury. McAllister arrived first, carrying his youngest child and supporting his wife, both showing advanced signs of cold exposure. Foster's family appeared shortly after, having abandoned their collapsed home with nothing but the clothes they wore. Harriet Miller came last, half carrying her hypothermic husband through snowdrifts that reached her waist. Wilhelm opened his door without hesitation, welcoming the refugees into the warmth that his ridiculed construction methods had preserved. The cabin that his neighbors had dismissed as foolishly built now stood as the only habitable structure in the settlement, its thermal mass radiating stored heat, while outside temperatures remained life-threatening. The lazy roof continued its work of natural snow management, while conventional steep pitches had failed catastrophically, and the supposed waste of his extended construction period had created the margin of safety that meant survival for everyone who had mocked his methods. Wilhelm's cabin, designed for a single family, now housed 13 people as the blizzard's aftermath revealed the full scope of the disaster. The stone walls that had seemed excessive during construction now proved their worth, radiating stored solar heat that maintained an interior temperature of 42 degrees even with the constant opening of doors and the additional body heat load. John McAllister's family occupied the space near the south-facing windows, where his wife slowly recovered from hypothermia while wrapped in Wilhelm's spare woolen blankets. The color gradually returned to her fingertips, and her shivering subsided as the thermal mass system continued its steady release of accumulated warmth. David Foster worked alongside Wilhelm to assess the structural damage throughout the settlement. Foster's roof had suffered a complete collapse along the eastern section, leaving 2/3 of his cabin exposed to the elements. The hasty construction methods that had seemed practical during the summer building season had proved inadequate for the extreme load conditions created by the February blizzard. His ridge beam, constructed from green pine that had never properly seasoned, had twisted under stress before snapping, creating a cascading failure that destroyed most of his carefully mortised joints. McAllister's partial roof collapse had occurred precisely where his steep pitch created the greatest snow load concentration. The 55-degree angle had trapped wind-driven snow in dense accumulations that exceeded 8 feet in depth along the ridgeline, creating a load of approximately 40 pounds per square foot, nearly double the bearing capacity of his hastily constructed rafters. The failure had begun at the peak, where inadequate bracing allowed lateral movement that stressed the entire structural system beyond its design limits. Harriet Miller's cabin remained structurally intact, but the combination of exhausted fuel supplies and her husband's hypothermic condition made it uninhabitable. Her steep-pitched roof had shed snow effectively during the early stages of the storm, but ice dams formed by the severe temperature fluctuations had created water penetration that soaked the interior walls and floor. With outdoor temperatures still hovering near 20 below zero, the moisture had frozen into sheets of ice that made heating the space impossible even with adequate fuel. As the emergency shelter situation stabilized, Wilhelm began sharing the technical knowledge that had made his cabin's survival possible. He explained to Foster how the 30-degree roof pitch matched the angle of winter sunlight at their latitude, maximizing solar gain during the coldest months when heating was most critical. The 3-foot overhang blocked high summer sun that would have overheated the interior, but allowed low winter rays to penetrate deep into the cabin and strike the thermal mass stones directly. The stone wall system fascinated Foster, who had dismissed it as wasteful during construction, but now observed its performance with growing admiration. Wilhelm demonstrated how the 12-inch square stones, positioned 4 inches thick along the south wall, absorbed solar energy throughout the day and released it gradually over 12 to 16 hours. Each stone weighed approximately 30 pounds and could store enough thermal energy during a single sunny day to provide measurable heat output through an entire cold night. McAllister, his initial skepticism replaced by desperate curiosity, asked detailed questions about the cabin's heating efficiency. Wilhelm's wood consumption data told a compelling story. His quarter-cord weekly usage represented less than half the consumption rate of conventional cabins in similar conditions. The thermal mass system had reduced his peak heating load by approximately 60% compared to traditional log construction, extending his fuel supply while maintaining superior interior comfort. Foster took careful measurements of Wilhelm's construction details, documenting the roof angle, overhang dimensions, stone placement, and window positioning with the precision of a man who understood he was witnessing superior engineering. The double wall construction with sawdust insulation had created thermal performance that conventional single log walls could not match, reducing heat loss through the building envelope while the stones actively contributed heat through radiant transfer. The survivors began planning immediate reconstruction efforts as soon as weather conditions permitted. Harriet Miller's husband, recovering from his hypothermic episode, expressed immediate interest in rebuilding with Wilhelm's proven methods. His near-death experience had eliminated any skepticism about innovative construction techniques, and he asked Wilhelm to guide the design of his new cabin from foundation to roof peak. McAllister faced the most complex reconstruction challenge, as his partial roof collapse required complete structural rebuilding while his family remained dependent on Wilhelm's shelter. He asked Wilhelm to calculate the proper dimensions for a 30-degree roof pitch on his existing foundation, recognizing that his survival had depended entirely on techniques he had previously dismissed as foolish. The man who had predicted Wilhelm's roof would collapse under snow load now sought to duplicate every aspect of the design that had saved his family's life. Word of the disaster and Wilhelm's successful design spread beyond the immediate settlement as other homesteaders ventured out to assess regional damage. Several families from neighboring claims arrived seeking shelter and advice, having heard that one cabin in the area had weathered the blizzard without structural failure. Wilhelm found himself explaining passive solar principles and thermal mass concepts to men who had never considered that building design could actively contribute to heating efficiency, rather than simply providing weather protection. The technical discussions that followed revealed the depth of Wilhelm's knowledge and the systematic thinking behind every construction decision. His roof angle calculations incorporated solar declination data for their specific latitude. His stone selection criteria included thermal conductivity properties and heat capacity measurements. His window placement followed principles of solar orientation that maximized energy gain while minimizing heat loss during non-solar hours. Foster, drawing on his New England carpentry background, recognized the sophistication of Wilhelm's approach and began taking detailed notes on construction techniques that could be adapted to local materials and conditions. The collaboration between the two men created a knowledge transfer system that would influence building practices throughout the territory, as word of Wilhelm's successful design spread among the survivors. As February progressed toward March and outdoor temperatures began their gradual climb toward survivable levels, the refugee families in Wilhelm's cabin began making specific plans for reconstruction. Every family committed to incorporating Wilhelm's proven techniques into their new homes, with modifications adapted to their individual needs and resources. The lazy roof that had been mocked during construction had become the model for an entire community's rebuilding effort, transforming frontier architecture through the harsh validation of extreme weather survival. By 1885, Wilhelm Brandt's construction techniques had spread across 3 counties in Dakota Territory, carried by survivors of the Great Blizzard who rebuilt their homes according to his proven methods. David Foster became the primary advocate for the new building style, incorporating Wilhelm's passive solar principles into a dozen cabins he constructed for incoming homesteaders. Each structure featured the characteristic 30-degree roof pitch, 3-foot southern overhang, and stone-lined interior walls that had proven so effective during the crisis that nearly claimed the original settlement. The Territorial Surveyor's Office began recommending shallow-pitched roofs for new construction, after documenting the structural failures that occurred during the February blizzard. Official reports noted that steep-pitched roofs had collapsed under snow loads in 17 different locations across the territory, while buildings constructed with slopes between 25 and 35 degrees had weathered the storm without structural damage. Wilhelm's specific 30-degree angle became the standard recommendation for residential construction at the 45th parallel latitude. John McAllister's rebuilt cabin incorporated every aspect of Wilhelm's design, from the calculated roof pitch to the precise placement of thermal mass stones along the south-facing wall. His new structure used 60% less firewood than his original cabin, while maintaining interior temperatures that averaged 15 degrees warmer during winter months. McAllister became an enthusiastic promoter of the techniques that had saved his family, sharing construction details with every homesteader who visited his improved property. Harriet Miller's new cabin featured innovations that extended Wilhelm's principles beyond their original application. Working with Foster, she incorporated additional thermal mass elements, including a stone floor along the southern exposure and carefully positioned interior stone walls that created thermal zones throughout the structure. Her fuel consumption dropped to 1/3 of typical frontier cabins, and her family's health improved dramatically as consistent interior temperatures eliminated the respiratory problems that had plagued them during their first harsh winter. The success of Wilhelm's methods attracted attention from territorial officials who documented the improved survival rates in communities that adopted passive solar construction techniques. Government reports noted that settlements using traditional steep-pitched roofs experienced mortality rates of 8% during severe winters, while communities incorporating shallow-pitched roofs with thermal mass systems reported mortality rates below 2%. The statistical evidence supported what the survivors had experienced directly. Wilhelm's building methods saved lives. Word of the innovative construction techniques reached established settlements throughout the northern plains as homesteaders traveled between communities sharing survival knowledge. Carpenters and builders from Minnesota and the Dakotas made pilgrimages to Wilhelm's original cabin, measuring angles and documenting construction details that they carried back to their own territories. The German method became synonymous with winter survival architecture, and Wilhelm found himself consulted on construction projects hundreds of miles from his original homestead. Foster established the first formal apprenticeship program for passive solar construction in 1882, training young carpenters in the technical principles that governed Wilhelm's success. The curriculum included solar angle calculations, thermal mass placement, insulation techniques, and structural engineering adapted to extreme climate conditions. Graduates of Foster's program carried standardized construction knowledge across the expanding frontier, creating consistency and building quality that improved survival rates throughout the region. The economic impact of Wilhelm's techniques became apparent as fuel costs decreased and agricultural productivity increased in communities that adopted improved building methods. Families who previously spent 40% of their income on heating fuel found themselves with resources to invest in livestock, equipment, and land improvements. The energy efficiency of their homes allowed them to redirect labor from constant firewood cutting to more productive agricultural activities that built long-term prosperity. Wilhelm's original cabin became an unofficial training center for frontier construction, with builders arriving regularly to study the techniques that had proven so effective. He welcomed visitors without charge, believing that knowledge meant to preserve life should be shared freely. His patient explanations of solar angles, thermal mass principles, and structural engineering educated hundreds of builders who carried his methods throughout the expanding territories of the American West. By 1887, territorial building codes officially adopted many of Wilhelm's innovations as recommended practices for residential construction. The codes specified minimum thermal mass requirements for northern latitude buildings, mandated specific roof pitch ranges for snow load management, and required southern exposure considerations in all residential site planning. Wilhelm's individual survival innovation had become institutionalized knowledge that would protect thousands of future settlers. The influence of Wilhelm's methods extended beyond immediate survival concerns to shape the development of sustainable architecture principles that would later influence 20th century building design. His integration of passive solar energy, thermal mass storage, and climate-responsive construction created a model for energy-efficient building that anticipated modern green architecture concepts by nearly a century. Engineering schools in eastern cities began studying reports of his techniques, recognizing their potential application in urban construction projects. Wilhelm continued farming and building until his death in 1894, having lived to see his once ridiculed methods become standard practice across the northern plains. His funeral drew homesteaders from across 3 states, many of whom credited their survival to construction techniques they had learned directly from him or through builders he had trained. The settlement, where he had faced mockery for his lazy roof, dedicated a memorial stone acknowledging him as the man whose knowledge had saved their community. Modern architects and engineers who study Wilhelm's cabin, now preserved as a historical site, recognize it as an early masterpiece of climate-responsive design. The building continues to demonstrate effective passive solar heating more than a century after its construction, with interior temperatures remaining comfortable even during contemporary harsh winters. Visitors can observe the thermal mass system functioning exactly as Wilhelm designed it, with stones absorbing solar energy during the day and radiating heat throughout cold nights. The legacy of Wilhelm's innovation extends far beyond the specific techniques he developed to encompass a broader principle that practical knowledge, properly applied, can overcome seemingly impossible survival challenges. His willingness to trust traditional European building wisdom over local conventional practices saved not only his own family, but established a foundation for improved frontier architecture that protected thousands of subsequent settlers who benefited from his carefully tested methods and the community of builders who carried his knowledge across the expanding American frontier.